Hello, my name is Francisco Guanero, and I'm going to do a brief and quick overview of the human authors of the New Testament. But first, I wanted to set the stage for the New Testament. Digging into the historical context is important because we need to understand the world of the first century and the Bible's intended audience. The time between the last pages of Malachi and the Gospel of Matthew is about 400 years, and it's typically referred to as the Intertestamental period, or also referred to as the silent years, because we have no biblical record for these years. If we back up a little bit before the end of the Old Testament, we find the kingdom of Israel conquered by the Assyrians and the tribe of Judah living independently in Judea until the Babylonians conquered Assyria and took over Judea, and the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon. Then the Persians took over Babylon and allowed the Jewish people to return back to Palestine. Then when the intertestamental period starts around 300 BC, Alexander the Great and his army conquer the Middle East. This begins the Hellenistic period, or the spread of Greek culture, and this was around 323 BC. When Alexander the Great died, his empire was divided into 4 parts ruled by one of his 4 leading generals. The Jewish people revolted after their temple was defiled, and this is known as the Maccabean Revolt in 167 BC, and this begins the Hasmonean period. The Jewish people take back Jerusalem and cleanse the temple, and then the Jewish territory, and they extend Jewish territory from Judea all the way to Galilee. And then the Romans came from the far west, and they defeated the kings that stemmed from Alexander's empire and the Hasmonean family, taking control of the Middle East. And this begins the period of the Roman Empire of the 1st century BC, and this is where the New Testament begins. Now that we have set the stage for the New Testament, who were the New Testament writers? The New Testament is a collection of 27 books, all written about 40 years from each other, written by 1st century followers of Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew, a Jewish tax collector. He wrote it in about 70 to 80 AD, and he was one of the 12 apostles. He was writing to the Jewish people. The second Gospel was the Gospel of Mark, who was a close associate of Peter, and Peter was one of the 12 apostles. Mark's book was written between 65 and 70 AD. He was writing to encourage Gentile Christians in Rome who were suffering persecution. It is believed that Mark's account was written first, and Matthew and Luke used it as a reference. The next book is the Gospel of Luke, written around 70 to 80 AD, written by a Gentile historian and physician named Luke. He was the only Gentile writer in the Bible who was writing to a leader in Rome named Theophilus, and also other Gentile Christians. Luke was a companion of the Apostle Paul. Luke also wrote the book of Acts, which reported the life and ministry of the early church. The last of the 4 Gospels is the Gospel according to John, written by John, who calls himself the disciple that Jesus loved. His book was written between 70 and 90 AD, and he was writing to the world. And he says, I write these things so that you may believe in Jesus, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. John is also believed by some to be called the elder who wrote the letters 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Those letters were written much later in his life. It's also believed that he may be the same John that wrote the book of Revelations, which is an apocalyptic letter of prophecy written close to the end of the 1st century. After the Gospel and Acts, we have the Pauline epistles. So who was the Apostle Paul? Paul was a persecutor of Christians named Saul of Tarsus. He was a Hebrew with a Greek heritage, very well educated, and was a Roman citizen. He had an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, where he was converted to Christ around 31 to 33 AD and became the Apostle Paul. 13 letters in the New Testament are connected to Paul, and that makes up almost a quarter of the New Testament. These letters provided teaching and guidance to local communities of Jesus' followers called churches. These letters include the letter to the Romans, the 2 letters to the Corinthians, the letter to the Galatians, the Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and two letters to the Thessalonians and 3 pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Lastly, Paul's shortest and most personal letters, Philemon. Now we have the rest of the general letters. Hebrews is anonymous, but some people believe it was also written by Paul. The letter of James is written by Jesus' half-brother James, who was a leader in the mother church in Jerusalem that was made up of mostly Christian Jews. 1st and 2nd Peter were written by the Apostle Peter. He was originally a fisherman named Simon, and he was one of Jesus' first disciples. He became a key leader in the early church. His letters were written while he was in Rome, much later in life, decades into his missionary work. The letters came from Peter, but were composed and written down by a co-worker named Silvanus. Finally, we have Jude, who wrote the letter of Jude. He was one of Jesus' 4 half-brothers, who became a traveling teacher and missionary. We don't know which church he was writing to, but most likely he was writing to the Messianic Jewish community. And these were the writers of the New Testament. Thanks.